When you write a program in Python and you want users to be able to access it from the web, they have to be able to talk to your program. And the way that happens is through this stack. And I'm going to explain this really quickly. So a browser typically goes to a web server. And in this case, we're talking about Nginx. And a web server is really good about finding a file on a system and just giving it to the browser. An example of this is a picture, an HTML page, maybe some music. These are static files. In other words, they don't change. They stay the same. The web server goes and picks them up and hands them to the browser. What a web server can't do is talk to Python because Python is dynamic. You give Python something and Python returns something. A web server just grabs files from a file system. So we need an intermediary for that. And this is where Gunicorn comes in. Now, sometimes they pronounce this differently, but I'm going to use the Gunicorn pronunciation. Gunicorn is a web server interface between your normal web server and being able to speak to an application, or in other words, a programming language. Gunicorn is a web server gateway interface, also known as WSGI, and you'll hear that a lot in the industry. So when Gunicorn gets a request, it sends it to Flask, and Flask actually is just a set of libraries that are made it for Python. And you can write Python code with Flask libraries to be able to send HTML and dynamic content back to a browser. So how this works is, let's say a user logs in. They hit the browser, they go to your website, it hits the web server, which recognizes this as an interactive request, which goes to Gunicorn. Gunicorn sends it to Python and Flask, where in the program you can say, please tell me your name. I can check the username. I send it back, yes or no. Now, if I were to send back an HTML file, Gunicorn would send that to Nginx. Nginx would give it to the user. The problem is, if I put all of my content, such as JPEGs and HTML, trying to come through Python and this stack, that's going to be really slow. So instead of doing that, if you send an HTML page and it has links to pictures or other things, then the web server will just pick these files up and send them directly to the user because they're static, they don't change. But if there is a dynamic page, something you want to update when the user tries to hit it, it will come down through Flask and then Flask will respond. One last piece, since Gunicorn is a middleware piece, if you will, if it has any kind of error logs, you won't see those because this web server captures errors. And in Flask, you can see that in Python. But Gunicorn, you have to set up a separate access log and error log file as well. In case something goes wrong, you can go and see what happens. So we'll be covering this setup on an Ubuntu server.